Obese girl was washing dishes. In freezing creek, mountain man built her a stove. She never expected. The winter of 1810 came early to the Idaho frontier, descending from the Bitterroot Mountains like a wolf pack hunting prey. By late October, ice had already begun forming along the edges of Blackthorn Creek, a narrow waterway that wound through the settlement of Pine Ridge like a silver ribbon. The creek's waters ran cold year-round, fed by snowmelt from peaks that never fully shed their white crowns. But in winter, the temperature dropped to a bone-numbing chill that could steal the feeling from fingers in minutes. Dinah Mitchell knew this cold intimately. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the western mountains and painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson, she would gather the day's dishes, tin plates crusted with bean residue, cast-iron skillets slick with animal fat, pewter cups stained with coffee, and carry them in a wooden bucket down the narrow path to the creek. Her aunt and uncle's cabin sat on a slight rise above the water, close enough that she could hear the constant murmur of the current, but far enough that the trek felt like a journey into exile. The path was worn smooth by her daily pilgrimages, a testimony to the countless times she had walked it over the past 3 years since her parents had died of fever. Dinah had been 14 then, plump even as a child, and the years of hard work and sparse meals had done little to change her frame. Her aunt, Constance Mitchell, never missed an opportunity to comment on it. "Wood is precious, girl," Constance would say, her thin lips pressed into a line of perpetual disapproval. "We can't be wasting it heating water for someone who isn't true family. The creek's been good enough for washing for 100 years. It's good enough for you." So Dinah washed in the creek, winter and summer, rain and shine. In summer, it was merely unpleasant. In winter, it was torture. On this particular December evening, Dinah knelt by the water's edge, her knees sinking into mud that had frozen into ridges hard as stone. The bucket of dirty dishes sat beside her, and she reached into it with hands already red and raw from previous washings. The first plate touched the water with a soft splash, and Dinah gasped as the cold shot through her fingers like 1,000 tiny knives. Her breath came out in white puffs that hung in the air before dissipating. She scrubbed at the dried beans with a rag, her movements becoming slower and clumsier as the cold seeped deeper into her flesh. Her fingers had lost most of their feeling after the first few minutes, which was almost a blessing. It meant she couldn't feel the cracks that had opened in her skin, or the way the frigid water stung the small cuts like alcohol in a wound. "Evening, Dinah." She looked up to see Martha Henshaw, the blacksmith's wife, passing by on the path with her own bucket, heading toward the community well. Martha's eyes held sympathy, but she didn't stop walking. Nobody ever did. The Mitchells owned the largest general store in Pine Ridge and held considerable sway over who got credit and who didn't. Crossing Constance Mitchell over something as small as a washerwoman's comfort wasn't worth the risk. Dinah nodded in greeting, unable to form words with her jaw clenched against the cold. She turned back to her washing, willing her hands to keep moving. 1 plate, 2 plates, 3 cups, a serving bowl. The pile seemed endless. By the time she finished, full darkness had fallen. The moon, nearly full, cast silver light across the creek's surface, making the ice crystals along the banks sparkle like scattered diamonds. Dinah tried to stand, but her legs had gone numb from kneeling. She fell forward, catching herself with her hands in the shallow water. The shock of submersion made her cry out, a sound that was swallowed immediately by the vast indifference of the wilderness. She pulled herself up, grabbed the bucket of clean dishes, and stumbled back up the path. Her hands were white, almost translucent in the moonlight, and when she reached the cabin door, she had to use her shoulder to push it open because her fingers wouldn't bend around the handle. Inside, her aunt sat by the hearth, the only source of heat in the cabin. Uncle Garrett was already snoring in the bedroom, his day's work at the store concluded. Constance didn't look up from her knitting. "Took you long enough," she said. "Put those away and get to your corner. And don't be using extra blankets. We need them for when the real cold comes." Dinah wanted to say that the real cold was already here, that it had been inside her bones for weeks now, that she wasn't sure how much longer she could endure. Instead, she said nothing. She put away the dishes, retreated to her small pallet in the corner farthest from the fire, and wrapped herself in her single thin blanket. That night, as she had for many nights before, she dreamed of warmth. Silas Cooper had been living in the mountains for 7 years, ever since he'd returned from the Lewis and Clark expedition with a head full of wilderness and no desire to return to civilization. He'd built a cabin in a high valley where eagles nested and elk grazed, where the only sounds were wind through pine trees and the occasional crack of ice breaking on the stream that ran past his door. He came down to Pine Ridge 4 times a year for supplies: salt, gunpowder, coffee, and sugar. He could have stayed in the mountains year-round, had done so once, his second winter, but he discovered that complete isolation did strange things to a man's mind. The quarterly trips kept him tethered, however loosely, to humanity. It was on such a trip in mid-December that he first saw Dinah at the creek. Silas had just left the general store, his pack heavy with purchases, when he decided to take the creek path back toward the forest trail. It was longer than the main road, but he preferred avoiding people when possible. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of gold and purple, and he was thinking about the week's ride ahead of him when he saw her. A young woman, though calling her young felt insufficient, as she had the worn look of someone much older, was kneeling by the water's edge. She was heavy-set, wearing a dress that had been patched so many times it was more patch than original fabric, and her hands were submerged in the creek. Even from a distance, Silas could see they were red and swollen. He stopped walking. The woman didn't notice him. She was focused entirely on scrubbing a plate, her whole body shaking with what he initially thought was effort, but then recognized as shivering. The temperature had dropped below freezing an hour ago. That water had to be barely above ice. Silas stepped closer. Dinah looked up, startled, her eyes widening at the sight of him. He knew he was an imposing figure, 6 feet 4 inches of muscle and beard, dressed in buckskins and fur, with a rifle slung across his back. Most people found him intimidating. "Why aren't you using hot water?" His voice came out rougher than he'd intended, ground down by years of minimal use. Dinah's expression shifted through surprise to something like shame. She looked down at her hands. "I'm not permitted," she said quietly. "Not permitted." Silas repeated the words slowly, testing them. "By who?" "My aunt and uncle. I live with them. They say wood is too precious to waste on someone who isn't real family." The words hung in the frozen air between them. Silas had seen many hard things in his life: men dying of exposure, starvation in winter camps, the casual cruelty of frontier justice. But something about this particular cruelty struck him differently. Perhaps because it was so unnecessary, perhaps because the woman accepting it so calmly, as if she deserved no better. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. 3 years, since I came to live with them." Silas nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else, just tipped his hat and continued down the path. But as he walked, his mind was working. He'd spent years in the wilderness learning to solve problems with his hands, how to build shelter, start fire in wet conditions, survive when survival seemed impossible. This was just another problem. And unlike most problems in the wilderness, this one had a solution. He made his decision before he'd gone another 100 yards. Silas didn't return to his mountain cabin that night. Instead, he made camp in the forest outside Pine Ridge and spent the hours until dawn thinking and planning. By the time the sun rose, he knew exactly what he needed to do. The challenge wasn't the construction itself. He'd built more complex structures in harsher conditions. The challenge was doing it without interference. He'd need materials, time, and most importantly, he'd need the Mitchell family to not try to stop him. He started by visiting the ruins of an old homestead 5 miles outside town. The family who'd lived there had died 2 winters back, smallpox, and their stone chimney still stood among the collapsed timbers of their cabin. Silas spent the morning carefully dismantling it, selecting the best stones and loading them onto a travois he'd fashioned from pine branches. For the next 2 days, he made similar trips gathering materials: stones from the old chimney, clay from the riverbank mixed with straw to make crude mortar, a sheet of iron from an abandoned mining camp, firewood split and stacked. He worked methodically, with the patient focus of someone who'd learned that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes in the wilderness led to death. On the 3rd day, just after dawn, he dragged his loaded travois into Pine Ridge. A few early risers watched him pass with curious eyes, but no one questioned him. Silas had a reputation. The mountain man who'd once killed a grizzly with a knife, who'd survived a winter trapped in a cave with a broken leg, who wanted nothing from anyone and therefore couldn't be controlled or influenced. People left him alone. He found the Mitchell cabin easily and walked around it until he spotted what he'd been looking for, a small patch of unused ground behind the house, near enough to be convenient, but far enough to be out of the way. It was covered in dead weeds and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Silas set down his travois and began to work. The sound of stones being moved brought Constance Mitchell to her back door within minutes. She stepped out, her face pinched with suspicion. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. Silas didn't stop working. He was laying out the foundation stones in a circle about 4 feet across. "Building a stove," he said simply. "On my property, without permission?" "I think not." Constance's voice rose, taking on the sharp edge of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Silas straightened to his full height and looked at her. He didn't say anything threatening. He didn't need to. His size, his stillness, the rifle leaning against a nearby tree, all of it communicated clearly enough. Constance's husband, Garrett, appeared in the doorway behind her. He took one look at Silas and put a hand on his wife's shoulder. "Now, Constance, let's not be hasty. Maybe we should hear what Mr. Cooper has in mind." "I'm building an outdoor stove," Silas said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request or a proposal, but a statement of fact. "For washing dishes. Won't take up much space, won't interfere with anything you're doing, but it'll be here when I'm done." He turned back to his work, effectively ending the conversation. Constance sputtered for a moment, but Garrett gently pulled her back inside. Through the open door, Silas could hear them arguing in whispers. He worked all day, stopping only briefly to drink water and eat some dried venison from his pack. The outdoor stove was based on a design he'd seen used by French trappers up north. The base was a ring of stones set deep in the ground for stability. The walls were built up in layers, each stone carefully fitted and held in place with the clay mortar. He left spaces for airflow at the bottom and created a small door for feeding wood into the fire chamber. The top was the trickiest part. He had to create a flat surface strong enough to hold a large pot of water while allowing heat to transfer efficiently. He used the sheet of iron he'd salvaged, cutting it to size with a hacksaw and setting it into the stone structure. Around it, he built up walls to create a windbreak and mounted hooks on either side for hanging pots. By late afternoon, Dinah had returned from her errands in town. She saw Silas working and stopped dead, her mouth falling open. He glanced up, nodded at her, and continued fitting stones. What are you doing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Building you a stove," Silas said, pressing mortar between 2 stones, "so you don't have to wash in the creek anymore." Dinah's eyes filled with tears. She opened her mouth to speak, closed it, then finally managed, "But why?" Silas had asked himself the same question over the past 3 days. The answer he'd settled on was simple, but felt inadequate spoken aloud. "Because nobody should have to do what you've been doing. Because I can build it. Because it's the right thing." He worked into the evening, finishing as the sun set. The structure stood about waist high, solidly built, with a large cast-iron pot positioned on top. Silas had filled it with water from the well and built a small fire in the chamber below to test the design. Within 20 minutes, steam was rising from the pot. He gestured for Dinah to come closer. She approached hesitantly, as if expecting the stove to disappear like a mirage. When she reached out and touched the warm stones, her tears spilled over. "Firewood stacked behind those trees," Silas said, pointing. "Enough for a month, maybe more. When you run out, send word to the trading post. I'll bring more." "I don't know how to thank you," Dinah said, her voice breaking. Silas shouldered his pack. "Don't need thanks, just use it." He started to walk away, then paused and turned back. "One more thing. This stove isn't just for dishes. You need hot water for anything. Washing clothes, bathing, warming yourself. You use it. That's what it's for." He left before she could respond, disappearing into the darkening forest like a spirit of the mountains returning to his realm. The stove changed everything, though not in ways that were immediately obvious. At first, Dinah used it exactly as Silas had intended, for washing dishes. Every evening, she would light a fire in the chamber, fill the pot with water from the well, and wait for it to heat. The first time she plunged her hands into warm water, she actually gasped. The sensation was so foreign, so luxurious that she started to cry again. Her hands began to heal. The cracks closed. The angry red inflammation faded to pink and then to the normal color of skin. Feeling returned to her fingertips, and with it came the realization of just how much pain she'd been in for 3 years. Constance and Garrett's reaction to the stove evolved over the first week. Initial outrage gave way to grudging acceptance when they realized Silas wasn't going to remove it and no one in town was going to side with them in a dispute with the mountain man. Then Constance noticed that the outdoor stove could be useful for tasks she didn't want to do inside: boiling laundry water, rendering fat, heating water for butchering. "I suppose," she said one morning, as if granting a great favor, "you may use the stove for other household tasks, but you'll need to keep the wood stocked yourself." It wasn't permission so much as appropriation, but Dinah didn't care. She had warm water, she had relief from the cold that had been slowly killing her. That was enough. The winter deepened. Snow fell in heavy blankets, covering Pine Ridge and the surrounding mountains. The creek froze solid, and Dinah would sometimes walk down the path just to look at it, remembering the agony of those washing sessions. The memory felt distant now, like something that had happened to someone else. Silas didn't return to town for 2 months. Dinah thought about him often, this strange, silent man who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she'd been too beaten down to pray. She wondered if he was safe in his mountain cabin, if he had enough food, if he thought of her at all, or if she was just another problem he'd solved and forgotten. Then, in late February, he appeared. Dinah was at the stove, heating water for laundry, when she heard footsteps crunching through the snow. She turned to see Silas approaching, a travois loaded with firewood behind him. He looked like a figure from a legend, covered in snow, his beard thick with ice, his eyes the only part of his face visible between his fur hat and raised collar. "Brought more wood," he said, as if 2 months hadn't passed since they'd last spoken. "Figured you might be running low." Dinah's heart did something complicated in her chest, a flutter, a squeeze, a sudden warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "I am," she managed. "Thank you. Please, let me give you something. Coffee? Food?" Silas hesitated, then nodded. Coffee would be welcome. They sat on logs near the stove, drinking coffee that Dinah had carefully hoarded from the store's supplies. Silas didn't talk much, but he listened as Dinah found herself speaking more than she had in months, about the town, about small happenings, about nothing and everything. "You seem different," Silas observed finally. "I am different," Dinah said. I'm not dying anymore. Slowly, I mean. Does that make sense?" Silas nodded. "It makes sense." After that, he came more regularly, once a month, then twice a month, always with firewood, always with some excuse about being in the area. But Dinah began to notice things. The way his eyes softened when he looked at her, the way he timed his visits for when Constance and Garrett were at the store. The small gifts he left, a rabbit he'd trapped, a handful of wild herbs, a perfectly smooth stone from the creek. Spring arrived with a burst of green and the sound of the creek running free again. Dinah found herself waiting for Silas's visits with an anticipation that surprised her. She started baking bread on days she thought he might come, and more often than not, she was right. The revelation came during a late spring thunderstorm. Silas had been helping Dinah move a heavy load of laundry when the sky opened up. They ran for the cabin, but Constance stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. "You can't come in," she said to Silas. "This is family only." "Aunt Constance, there's a storm," Dinah began. "Then he can take shelter somewhere else. My home. My rules." The door slammed. Dinah stood in the rain, shocked into silence. Then fury, pure, bright, and completely unfamiliar, flooded through her. She turned to Silas, who had already started walking toward the forest. "No," she said. Her voice came out stronger than she'd ever heard it. "No, you're not going out there." She marched to the stove, which had a small overhang she'd rigged for keeping firewood dry. It was barely enough space for one person, let alone two, but Dinah didn't care. She pulled Silas under it, and they stood pressed together, listening to rain hammer the earth. "You don't have to," Silas started. "Yes, I do," Dinah interrupted. "You built me a stove when nobody else would help. You've brought me firewood all winter. You've treated me with more kindness than my own family. So yes, I do have to." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Silas spoke, his voice low and rough. "I need to tell you something." "What?" "I didn't just build this stove because it was the right thing. I mean, it was, but—" He paused, struggling with words. "I've been alone a long time. I chose it, liked it that way, but seeing you at that creek, seeing someone treated like they didn't matter, it woke something up in me, something I thought I'd left behind when I went to the mountains." Dinah's heart was pounding. What did it wake up? The need to protect someone, to care about someone, to— He looked directly at her, and his eyes were fierce and vulnerable at once. To not be alone anymore. The rain fell around them. The world smelled of wet earth and pine. And Dinah, who had spent 3 years believing she was worthless, who had thought kindness was something reserved for other people, made a choice. She kissed him. News of Dinah and Silas's courtship spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire. Some people thought it was romantic, the mountain man and the washerwoman. Others thought it was scandalous. Constance thought it was an outrage. "You're not marrying that savage," she told Dinah. "I forbid it." "I don't need your permission," Dinah replied, surprising herself with her own calm. "I'm 20 years old. I can make my own decisions. You're living under my roof." "Then I'll leave." And she did. That very night, she packed her few belongings and walked to Martha Henshaw's house. The blacksmith's wife, who had watched Dinah wash dishes in the creek for 3 years with helpless sympathy, opened her door immediately. "I should have done this long ago," Martha said, pulling Dinah inside. "You can stay here as long as you need." The wedding was simple, performed by the circuit preacher who came through town once every 3 months. Dinah wore a dress Martha had sewn for her from new fabric, the first new clothing she'd owned in years. Silas wore his cleanest buckskins and looked terrified and happy in equal measure. They were married on a warm June day, standing by the stove Silas had built. It seemed fitting. Dinah's first sight of Silas's cabin made her catch her breath. It sat in a high valley surrounded by mountains that still held snow on their peaks even in summer. The cabin itself was sturdy and well built, with a stone chimney and real glass windows, a luxury in the wilderness. "You built this?" she asked, awed. "Over 3 years," Silas said. "Used to think it was everything I needed. Now I know it was just waiting." "For what?" He looked at her, his stern face softening into something that might have been a smile. "For someone to make it a home." Life in the mountains was hard but honest. Dinah learned to shoot, to trap, to preserve meat and gather wild plants. She learned the silence of the high country and discovered that she loved it, that the absence of judgment and cruelty was its own kind of paradise. But she also learned that Silas carried scars deeper than any mountain winter could inflict. One night, as they lay in bed listening to wolves howl in the distance, he told her about his time with Lewis and Clark, about the men who had died, about the weight of survival. He told her why he'd fled to the mountains, not because he hated people, but because he'd seen too much death and couldn't carry it in crowded places. "But you came back," Dinah said softly. "You came down from the mountain for me." "I came down because you reminded me that there are still things worth coming down for," Silas replied. Their first winter together was brutal. Snow fell early and deep, burying the valley in white. For 3 months they were completely cut off from the outside world. Dinah learned what isolation truly meant, not the loneliness of living with people who hated you, but the singular focus of living with only one other person in all the world. There were hard moments, times when the cabin felt too small, when they got on each other's nerves, when the silence pressed in like a physical weight. But there were more moments of quiet companionship, reading aloud by firelight, cooking together, lying in bed and listening to the wind. In February, Dinah realized she was pregnant. She told Silas on a clear morning when the sun turned the snow to diamonds. He stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable, and she felt fear flutter in her chest. Then he dropped to his knees in the snow and pressed his ear to her still flat belly. "I can't hear anything yet," he said, wonder in his voice. "You won't be able to for months." "I know, but I'm listening anyway." Their daughter was born in late September, delivered with Martha Henshaw's help. Silas had ridden down from the mountain to fetch her, knowing that some things required expertise he didn't have. The birth was long and difficult, But when it was over, Dinah held a tiny red-faced baby who had Silas's eyes and her own dark hair. Rebecca, Dinah whispered. It had been her mother's name. Silas touched his daughter's small hand with one finger, his expression one of absolute terror and absolute love. She's so small. How is she so small? She'll grow, Dinah said, smiling through exhaustion, and grow she did. Rebecca became a mountain child, wild and curious, as comfortable in the wilderness as her father. By the time she was 3, she could identify animal tracks and knew which plants were safe to eat. By 5, she could shoot a rifle almost as well as her mother. But Dinah and Silas didn't want her to be isolated the way he had been. So they made compromises. They spent summers in the mountain cabin, but came down to Pine Ridge for winter, renting a small house on the edge of town. Rebecca attended the new schoolhouse that had been built. She made friends. She lived in both worlds. On Rebecca's 10th birthday, Dinah decided to take her to see the creek. They walked down the familiar path, now overgrown with disuse. The Mitchell cabin still stood, though Constance and Garrett had both died. She of pneumonia, he of a heart that finally gave out. The property belonged to distant relatives now, people who nodded politely when they passed on the street but had no history with Dinah. The creek ran clear and cold, just as it always had. Dinah knelt at the edge, remembering. "This is where I used to wash dishes," she told Rebecca, "every day for 3 years in water so cold it cracked my hands until they bled." Rebecca looked horrified. "Why?" "Because I thought I had no choice. Because I believed what people told me about my worth." Dinah touched the water. It was still freezing, even in summer. "But then your father showed me different. He showed me that kindness exists, that I deserved better, that I was worth the effort of building something good." "The stove," Rebecca said. She'd heard the story many times. "The stove," Dinah agreed. "But not just that. He built me a life. We built it together." They walked back up the path, past where the stove had stood. The stones had been scattered, the structure reclaimed by time and weather. But it didn't matter. The real structure, the one made of trust and love and mutual respect, that one still stood, solid as mountain granite. Dinah stood in the doorway of their cabin, watching Silas teach their grandson, Rebecca's son, how to split wood. Her husband was 60 now, his beard entirely gray, his movements slower but still certain. Their grandson, Michael, was 8 and worshipped his grandfather with the fierce devotion of childhood. "Like this, Grandpa?" Michael swung the axe and the log split cleanly. "Exactly like that," Silas said, pride evident in his voice. Rebecca emerged from the cabin, carrying a pot of coffee. She was 30 now, married to a good man she'd met in town, a carpenter who loved her fierceness and didn't mind that she could outshoot him. She poured coffee for everyone and settled beside her mother. "Thinking about the old days?" Rebecca asked. "Always," Dinah admitted. "I was just remembering the first time I used that stove your father built. How strange it felt to have warm water. How I cried because someone had finally been kind to me." "It's a good story." "It's a true story," Dinah corrected. "That's what makes it good." Silas and Michael finished with the wood and joined them. They sat together in comfortable silence, drinking coffee and watching the sun set over the mountains. Somewhere in the valley below, Pine Ridge had grown into a real town with 2 stores, a church, and a school. But up here, in this high place, time moved differently. Silas reached over and took Dinah's hand. It was warm and calloused from work but whole, healed long ago from the damage of freezing water. She squeezed back, a gesture so familiar it was almost unconscious. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For building me a stove." Silas smiled, a real smile, the kind that had taken him years to relearn. "I'd build you 1,000 stoves if you needed them." "I know," Dinah said. "That's why I only needed one." They sat together as darkness fell and the first stars appeared, a family carved from kindness and built to last, solid as stone and warm as fire, enduring as the mountains themselves.